Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started soon. We're just waiting for a few more people to arrive. In the interim, please introduce yourself in the chat. All right. Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Stephen Horn of Clean Creative South Africa. It's a really great honor to have you with us this morning. I just want to start by acknowledging everyone's time and thank you for being here and the panel as well. But I think to kick us off, I'll just hand over to our co-hosts for this event, She Changes Climate. That would be Natalie. Natalie, if you could get things going and tell us a little bit more about She Changes Climate. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about She Changes Climate, what we do, what guides our values, our principles, and ultimately who we are. So we start with a very basic or simple statement, but one that packs such a powerful punch, and that is climate change affects the whole world, not half of it. And this has been sort of our strapline and guiding principle since our inception in 2021, just before COP26. Now, our mission statement, so She Changes Climate, is a global movement enabling women in all their diversity to lead equitable climate action. So we believe in a co-shared leadership model where men and women are working together to increase female representation at all levels of climate decision-making. We do our work, or we campaign by influencing governments, raising awareness of inequalities, amplifying women's voices, and collaborating with other organizations. We are committed to ensuring that women are able to make the critical decisions required to resolve the current crisis that's affecting both people and the planet. Now, how we work is sort of a two-prong approach. We have a top-down policy advocacy targeting key decision makers, but at the same time, and this is more or less what we are, our focus for 2024 and perhaps also 2025, which is the bottom-up mobilization and public pressure. So ultimately, with all of the work that we're doing, we are increasing women's participation at local, national, and global policy and decision-making levels. And we do this through a number of ways. We collaborate with partners. This is one such example of a collaborative product or output. We create spaces to bring people together. And then we also do a lot of capacity building through working with various women and men in all their diversity in different parts of the world. Now, the three pillars that ultimately sum up what we do is this advocacy and policy, where we influence climate policy for increased diversity and inclusion. And then we also do a lot of public campaigning. And this is where we've, I think, where we've actually mastered or grown our audience on social media. It's really just creating content that is both informative, educational, and really just enables people to understand that each one of us can be part of this movement altogether. And then finally, strengthening women-led climate action. So amplifying voices through building a network. Now, some of the partners that we have had the pleasure of, sort of working with from 2.5 years ago till today are displayed on the screen. We've had a number of events, both virtual, in person, in different countries as well. And very excited to, also add Clean Creative South Africa to this list of partners. So just want to end our introduction to She Changes Climate with some words from Christiana Figueres. And she posted this on her LinkedIn yesterday. And she said, when women thrive, we see different behaviors, alternative leadership styles, and ultimately the formation of a different system, one which values empathy, collaboration, vulnerability, and intuition, a system which values all beings equally. And I think that is ultimately the basis of this webinar as we bring women leaders in climate and business and have such a meaningful conversation, which I hope everybody can take away 1, 2, maybe several things from. So I'll end there, and then I'll pass it on to Emma from Clean Creative.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Emma Cuore and I work at Clean Creative South Africa alongside our country director, Stephen Horn. So happy belated International Women's Day, first of all. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we do. So Clean Creative South Africa is the local arm of the global Clean Creatives movement. And we bring together South African media agencies, their employees and industry clients to address the ad and PR industry's work with the fossil fuels that are the principal cause of climate breakdown. So globally, we have almost 1,000 agencies and over 2,000 individual creatives commit to the Clean Creatives Pledge, which is a commitment to decline future work from fossil fuel companies. And if you're interested, you can learn more about the pledge at cleancreatives.org. I'll also leave a link in the chat. And just last year, we launched the South African F-List 2023, listing the 41 South African ad and PR agencies working for the fossil fuel industry in South Africa. The F-List was featured in various media outlets like News 24, Financial Mail, Business Day. I did that and more. You can also read more about the F-List. I'll leave that in the chat as well. And please don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter or X. Myself and Stephen are also on LinkedIn, and we share a LinkedIn page with the Global Clean Creatives team. I'll also leave all of those links in the chat. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. You can find our emails there on the screen. And yeah, I just want to say thank you on behalf of Clean Creatives We are very grateful for our co-hosts, She Changes Climate, our incredible panelists, and all of you for joining us here today to have a very meaningful discussion. So yeah, that's all from me. So thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma and Natalie. That's really exciting. And I guess that takes us to the discussion part of the conversation today. So yes, let me just also welcome everyone and thank She Changes Climate for collaborating with us on this. So today our discussion is titled Women for Change, Uniting Business and Climate Leaders for a Sustainable Future. So I think it's worth pointing out that the collaboration with She Changes Climate came about as the result of someone from their team taking the Clean Creatives Pledge. And I think that's a testimony to the ongoing power of a movement based on relationships and shared values. Natalie, you somewhat beat me to it. A quote from Christiana Figueres. I was listening to her wonderful podcast this morning, Outrage and Optimism, and she was interviewing an author called Gaia van der Esch, who's got a new book called Leading Our Way, How Women Are Redefining Leadership. And when it came to values, there was a conversation around sort of three things that I thought were interesting to point out, which is the shift in leadership from insensitivity to empathy, from putting profits ahead of everything to putting morality first, and from moving from competition to collaboration. And I think your quote there was perfect and spoke to that. Gaia also made the point, the author, that a new generation of leaders is emerging, which shares these values and will bring about the changes we need as they progress in their careers, but that we should be outraged at the slow pace of change and their forces holding back progress. And one of those forces, as we know, is greenwashing and the delayed tactics by fossil fuel companies, which incidentally also use gender washing and, this technique to make them seem very progressive and elevating women, when in actual fact, that's a technique to mislead us as well. So yeah, again, critical for us as creatives to reconsider those ties to the fossil fuel industry and to start cutting ties. I'm very excited to announce that we have a significant new pledge signature in the form of an agency called DNA Brand Architects. Their the leader of the company, Sylvester Chalk, confirming that with us this week. That's a major Johannesburg-based agency that is now moving away from doing any fossil fuel work. So something else to be outraged about as we celebrated International Women's Day yesterday, or attempted to celebrate, is the ongoing conflict in Palestine and the terrible loss of life there, obviously, of women and girls being affected too. The precarious state of our world, from the worsening climate crisis to global conflict and weakening democratic systems, is precisely why we need to elevate the voices of women, because clearly the patriarchal system has failed us. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our great panel today. Tracy Davies is Executive Director at Just Share SA, a nonprofit shareholder activism organization using responsible investment and sustainable finance to drive urgent action to combat climate change and reduce inequality. Thank you, Tracy, for joining us. Phumla Duma is digital campaigner at PowerShift Africa, a think tank that aims to mobilize climate action in Africa, amplify African voices, and foster international collaboration to accelerate the continent's transition to 100% renewable energy. Thanks, Phumla. Emma King is the founder and managing director at Clean Creatives pledge signing agency, the Friday Street Club, an award-winning creative marketing and communications agency based in Cape Town. Nolita Mvunelo is the program manager at the Club of Rome, a diverse platform of thought leaders dedicated to finding holistic solutions for global challenges and advocating for policies and actions to address multiple planetary emergencies. And Dr. Okita Wedi is the founder and CEO at Creative Development, a Pan-African advocacy and storytelling organization committed to driving positive change across the African continent. Very esteemed panel, round of applause. Thank you. I think we need the little applause sound effect. But anyway, so to jump right into it, from the introductions, I think one of the things that unites this panel is communication, whether it's fighting greenwashing and our work in PR, trying to advocate for the policy levers we need. I'd love to start off, if you could just briefly, feel free to introduce yourselves further, speak a little bit more about your work. And if you want to launch right into it, maybe answer the question, what have you seen play out as the key challenge to communicating climate change in your field? And does gender play a role in that? So I think to start off, if we could just start perhaps with Tracy. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Stephen, and morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think I will jump straight into the question because I think it's really connected to your quote from Christiana Figueres, in that it's all about communication, because the world is run by, in the language which we use to run the world, or which is used to run the world, is the language of markets and money and profit. And the people that we engage with, the corporate sector in South Africa, so executives at listed companies, asset managers, really the heart of the financial sector, they use one language, and that language is the language of markets and money. And there is no vocabulary in that language for the climate crisis or for any kind of ecological crisis, actually. And in fact, this is really well illustrated by the fact that we don't quantify the accounting and economics does not quantify damage to the environment. They don't, you can't work out what it is. You can work out exactly how much profit you make and how many widgets you make and what you earn from selling those widgets, but there is no mechanism for calculating the damage you cause in doing so. So we call these things negative externalities, right? It's just the stuff that happens while we're making money, and we don't think about that. And it's the fact that we don't think about it and that we don't talk about it that has resulted in these multiple planetary crises that we're facing now. So the challenge in communicating that we have in our work is that these are considered, in the world of economics and financial markets, these issues are considered soft issues, feminine issues, It's women who care about trees and animals and nature because they don't understand how the world works, they don't understand how you make money and the realities of, if you want to make money, you're going to damage stuff and there's nothing we can do about it. So there is a huge kind of architecture of language that is used in the way that everybody communicates about the world all the time, that completely and utterly excludes any talk or discussion of the damage we're causing to the planet. And so that is the challenge that we face every day, is how to get people to understand that this is something they have to take seriously, a problem that they are contributing to, not just, passive onlookers, and that they have the power within what they do to change that it is not something that exists outside of their worlds, which they have no influence over. So that is a real struggle for us. It's often like you're talking a completely different language.
That's really true. And what you were saying about the way the critical issues are pushed to the side and made to seem not serious, or somehow feminized, or women issues that aren't to be taken seriously, this is precisely the problem, and why platforms like She Changes Climate are so essential. So Emma, I see you'd like to make a point.
Yeah, sure. So I'm speaking from the creative agency point of view, and where we sit is our role is storytelling and creating narratives. We're approached by brands and businesses to tell their story, and often cases it's to drive public perception on what people think about them and how they engage. And really, when you're talking about an issue like this, it's the people with the most money who have the biggest share of voice. And that really is that, in these kind of day and ages, it is the big fossil fuel companies. It is the big global emitters. It is the big ones that are putting a huge amount of their budget into trying to keep their industry alive. And whatever needs to be done to do that, they will do that. And narrative forms a big part of that. But what we see is really, in many times, the people that really are being impacted by the climate crisis or other things are the women, but not just women, it's other marginalized communities. It might be people in rural areas. In South Africa, it's people who are unemployed, who don't have a huge educational background. And essentially, I see that they are the silent voices. They don't have a voice. They don't have the budget. They don't have the access. And they are not allowed to be able to tell their story to combat these big businesses that are telling their stories. And so when I got into the communications industry and founded this business, long before I came across a clean creative pledge, I really sat there and thought, do I want to be using my skills and my background to be building a better place or helping the world be a better place, or do I want to be one of those people who kind of signs up to where the biggest buck is, and being part of these narratives? And I made a choice a long time ago that wherever I could, I would be someone that helped some of these silent voices have their voice. And I think that's, for me, the role that narratives and communication can play, however small. Even if we don't have those big budgets, perhaps we can be some of these people who can be on behalf of the silent voices.
That's a beautiful point, Emma, and I'm so glad you're making it, because that's in my experience with Clean Creatives. I've seen this again and again. I remember last year when we had our event in Johannesburg, a lot of people would make the point from the agency side that, you know, this climate thing isn't a bread and butter issue, and, you know, we are creating employment. We are, you know, while working for these really problematic brands that are actually creating so many other issues, and so there's felt like there's a communication disconnect between those voices at the periphery and then people working inside who I think genuinely think they're doing good. So I'd love to hear from you, Pumla, if you'd like to speak to that, and of course add anything else from your perspective working in the campaigning space.
Thanks, Stephen. So I think just to add on to what has been said by Tracy and Emma, from a digital communications perspective, we find ourselves in a different challenge of trying to find innovative, timely, and engaging ways to ensure that these experiences of these women on the ground, rural women, who may not have access to the things that people in the cities have access to, we're trying to make them become more visible, that they can tell their story their way, and that those who are receiving that story also resonate with the experiences, but are also able to see these experiences as a credible contribution to the realities of the climate crisis. But this can be very difficult in the digital communications, because we're grappling with the changing algorithms, we're grappling with the introduction of new and hip apps, we're grappling with short attention spans, and we're also competing with what people deem as more entertaining conversations. And unfortunately, for the most part, gender isn't always included in those entertaining conversations. And of course, we're also grappling with bigger companies or bigger organizations who are able to afford to pay to have their voices heard more, or at least the type of campaigns that they put out heard more than the type of campaigns that we put out, which are actually showing what's happening on the ground. And I think also, just to add on the gender element of what's happening digitally, if you're on Twitter right now, I can promise you that you know that there's a very scary and a very visible gender war going on, where the men in our societies are becoming more and more conservative. And so there's a lot of pushback on women's autonomy, and a lot of pushback on women's experiences and the stories that we have to tell. And unfortunately, that very same mentality has trickled into the climate space. So,
that's so interesting, really interesting observations around what's happening in the digital sphere, which governs so much of our lives and the way we think about things. You know, I'm just like feeling like we just don't make enough progress because we're constantly being deliberately confused by these very dark algorithms. And if I look at an example recently, like I also run a satirical news show called Politically Aware, and we've just done a deep dive into sports washing and how that works. And you know, one of our targets in that video is Total Energies, which uses the African Cup of Nations to you know, burnish its image and make us all love them because we all love African football, while they're the chief you know, oil company extracting new sources of fossil fuels across the continent. And then up in my YouTube feed comes these other videos, oil discovered in South Africa, and completely they have like hundreds of thousands of views, and it just doesn't seem organic. It seems like a lot of it's being pushed And it's really framing the conversation in the way that suits those fossil fuel companies' agenda around, oh, but it's economic versus environmental concerns. And, how do we, so it's so manipulative and clever. And so anyways, I just thought that what you're saying, again, Greta Thunberg versus Andrew, whatever the name is of that guy, that's another one of those gendered moments that comes to mind. So how do we, moving on to the next question, involve women's voices at the table and ensure they have equal representation? I think, Pumla, you made the point about the COP committee for this year initially being all men when we first chatted about this conversation. So perhaps a question to who has not spoken yet, speaking of voices. Nolita, let's chat to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Thank you. This is quite an exciting conversation, actually. I've just been sitting here going, oh, okay, this is good to know. Because a lot of the work of the Club of Rome focuses on understanding and learning how to work with this type of complexity, right? Because when we speak about, I guess from the perspective of fossil fuels, is that there is that complexity of, oh, but so much still relies on fossil fuels. So how do we then manage the transition of society, both in the material sense, but also in the cultural sense, to make sure that we're going towards societies that are more geared towards global equity on a healthy planet? And it's not as simple as saying, it will be an easy shift from one thing to another thing, because we all know that many things have unintended consequences. And that then becomes the role of equity and voices in systems transformation. For example, to Tracy's point about corporate execs don't really speak in the language of environment, etc., but they do speak in the language of supply chains, because I have like an engineering degree. They speak in the language of supply chains, and that is typically when those conversations come up. But the current infrastructure allows you to delay the supply chain conversation enough that you could focus on short-term profits while treating the system's consequences of your behavior as a thing you will have to deal with later. So to what extent is law catching up and holding accountable, creating standards for that, to make sure that that part is an equal conversation to the part of the profit conversation? But on the point of including voices, then equity also becomes equity becomes important, because the material reality of what happens between the narrative and what has to happen on the day-to-day is important. And the material reality of most people is not reflected, as Pumla said, is not reflected in the conversations that we're having on a day-to-day basis. South Africa being a very good example of that. We have frustrations about what the feed is showing us, what campaigns are saying, what is happening in XYZ. But when we speak about material concerns of people on a day-to-day basis, most of those people do not interact with media the same way that most of us in this conversation do. So to what extent do we have an opportunity to show that different worldview, that different perspective, that different way of living as different types of solutions or different types of opportunities to create a new outcome? A lot of it has to do with allowing access so that there can be increased participation in these conversations. And allowing access can be in the form allowing access for women specifically is in the form of education and healthcare access, so that there's choice, financial independence, so that there's increased participation in lawmaking, in policy making, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Nolita. Very, very good points. And I think what you're saying about the way we're engaging in this conversation and narrative and our understanding of the issue, and how that's actually quite niche when you look at the broader society. Well, that comes down to a question of like who is shaping the narrative. I like what Emma was saying earlier about how the person with the most money in the room can shape the narrative. I mean, that's what we see when we struggle to get our politically aware content out there. And then there's, with the truth bombs, and then the sort of our opponents have, these massive advertising budgets at their disposal. So perhaps Emma, would you have a comment on the role advertising and PR can play here, perhaps as a force for good. And also, if you'd like to speak to your own sort of experience of your agency and engaging with the Clean Creative Pledge and where that's been helpful or interesting.
Yeah, sure. So from my personal opinion or my personal experience, since we signed the pledge, which I think was about a year ago, it's been quite interesting. We've actually been approached by 4 different businesses to work on them, which operate within the fossil fuel industry, which we've turned down. It's been quite interesting having signed the pledge. It's quite an easy way to kind of go back and say, well, thanks very much, but we've signed this pledge, so no hard feelings, but we're not the best agency for you. But conversely to that, we've actually signed up a number of new clients within the renewable space who have approached us and seen that we've signed the pledge and they want to work with businesses that share their values. And I think it was interesting that you said earlier is that having dealt with agencies, you say that they say they need the budgets, they're creating employment and so on. But really, you know, things don't always have to be that way. People have to stand up and make a stand and go, you know, one person can make a difference, and lots of people being individuals can start to add up and make a difference. And really what I wanted to say was there's this concept that we have to work with these people with the big budgets because we have to run businesses and create jobs. But I've certainly found in my experience is that it is able to do really good work, to be a purpose-driven business, to have fun, to treat people well, and also to make money at the same time. These things don't have to be mutually exclusive. So the idea is build what you want or that you believe in, and the right people will come.
That's such a great philosophy. And I just think like if we can all start thinking, you know, more like that, we'll start building the world that we need to see. And from there, I don't know if we have, I think Dr. Okito Wedi's joined us, also runs an agency. Okito, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Stephen. Apologies for being slightly late and for my camera being off, but I can hear you, yes.
No problem at all. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, would you like to tell us a little bit about your agency and the work you're doing? And if you'd like to reflect off of what Emma was saying about how there's like that little meme of the little girl who says like, why not both, you know? And I think that's what the fossil fuel industry wants us to think. We can only have like this or that, but we can actually build a world of both.
Absolutely. So I run an organization called Creative Development. We're a Pan-African organization that essentially uses the power of storytelling, the art, as well as research to tell a new story or a new narrative around the African continent and what is essentially the Africa that we want to see. And the hope around this work, or our aim rather, is really trying to connect communities and people to policymakers in a true and authentic way. And I couldn't agree more with Emily coming into the space, particularly as a young woman of color, where it kind of feels as though every single resource that you need to be able to do impactful work on the continent is limited. Doors are being closed left and right. And so you find moments where you almost feel like you need to compromise on your ethics, your moral judgment to be able to move the needle forward. But in 3 years of doing this work, I do find that at least one, the quality of our work has been able to go to a new level just by virtue of kind of standing in our ground of what we know to be true for ourselves and the work that we want to do on the continent. I do feel that people feel that, at least the right partners that you want to be working with feel that, know that. And when you are able to align with the kind of people who understand the kind of work that you want to do, the footprint that you want to have in the world, and they want to back you on that, I think the quality of the work showcases that. I think it's a much more fruitful, fun experience for both yourself, your team, and the partners that you have on board. And I think the people on the other side, at least from the target audience that we're trying to reach, appreciate that as well. Having worked with different agencies over the years, where you kind of feel like there's a discrepancy with what it is that they're trying to put forward in the world and the values that they hold themselves. These things, people can't be mocked. These things are felt, these things are seen, and I think it displays in other ways, and fundamentally in the work and the messages that you're trying to put out at the end. So we don't get around it. we never get around this thing. And so with being able to quote unquote try and do things the right way, I have felt as though, yeah, it's probably been personally for me one of the most fun things, one of the most fulfilling things I've done in my career, in my life. And in terms of the impact and the work that we've done, it's been able to hit all those markers, and we've still been able to find the resource, and we've still been able to grow. So it really isn't it's not a zero-sum game in the way that we've been kind of brainwashed, I want to say, to think about this thing before. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Wow, that's completely true. I love what you were saying there. And I was wondering whether I could throw it perhaps to Tracy next to just reflect on those thoughts as well around, you know, this notion that just to sort of, I suppose it links off of that, the idea that the pragmatic way forward is this zero-sum way for some reason. And are there any blocks that you're seeing, Tracy, in terms of the work that you do day to day? You're often dealing with, you know, corporate SA and trying to hold them to account, the shift the dial, shift the needle, you know, tackling Sasol's immense power and that kind of legacy company that has that huge polluting footprint, and trying to shift things in the right direction. When it comes to perhaps, especially from a gender lens, and you're seeing who's making these decisions and where are you seeing the blocks to actually those companies advancing on climate action and not just paying lip service to it?
Well, there's a really interesting phenomenon that I find it fascinating, that you have in almost every big corporate that we engage with, the sustainability team is all female. So you have you have a suite of executives who are all male, and then you have a head of sustainability or ESG, you know, some kind of title related to ESG and sustainability. So on the one hand, that makes sense, right? Because that's, as we've been saying, it's really women who kind of care about these things and speak this language in general. I would say more than men do. But although that's obviously a huge generalization, but you know what I mean. It's the Figueres quote kind of thing. It's a different way, a different approach to the world. So those people are hugely committed to what they are doing. My experience is not that they are in those roles just to, you know, as a greenwashing exercise. They genuinely want to be in companies where they can make a difference. But their power is very limited because they are sort of encapsulated or surrounded by the traditional patriarchal power system, the language of, you know, the language of the markets, as I was saying. And so they struggle to be heard, or to be heard in a way that actually results in change. And one of the most interesting things we've seen in our work is feedback from those people, obviously not in a way that they would want their bosses to know about, but people saying the pressure that you're putting on this company has suddenly elevated my role within the company. They're actually listening to me now because they can see that this is a real threat to them and that they need to take it seriously. So that's that combination of external pressure and internal commitment, I think, is a really important driver of progress. But the blocks to that progress are the fact that I think certainly in the initial stages, people were appointed to these roles, or these committees and teams were created within these countries as companies, as a PR exercise, not as a genuine, not because of a genuine desire to change the way the company operates. And so it's very interesting to see that dynamic shifting as there's more pressure from outside on these companies. There are power dynamics changing within the organizations, but not enough yet, I think, to make significant change, but it's definitely shifting.
Well, there's some optimism on this just belated day after International Women's Day. Sounds like at least things are moving in a good direction, but as reminded of the point that someone was making on that podcast I was listening to earlier today, Gaia, the author, just the speed is the issue. We have so little time to decarbonize so fast, and culture changes slowly. So Pumla, did you want to add anything there?
Yes, I did. Firstly, I'm very happy to hear that there's a positive outcome within the corporate space, within this type of conversation. And I think the reason I raised my hand is because I wanted to just kind of talk about the blockages that we experience in the climate space from a campaigning perspective, and which the biggest one being when it comes to women being unable to legitimize their experiences as more than just anecdotal evidence, and having to have conversations with policymakers, economists, and lobbyists, who in most cases are predominantly men, as we saw with the COP29 appointment of an all-men panel. We realize that there's such a huge role that misogyny and classism is playing, that is blocking the woman from the campaign perspective, or the woman on the ground with the lived experiences, from being able to have a success story similar to the one that Tracy has highlighted. And so while the evidence is mounting, and while we are speaking to quote unquote the smartest people in the world, because these people have gone to Harvard and Oxford and all these prestigious universities, it's almost as if because they don't like who the messenger is, they seem to think that the messenger is not worthy. And so it is important for us to have these type of conversations, and also try and find ways that we can put so much pressure on these people that they are able to see that it is very important for these women on the ground to have the same successes as the women in corporate are starting to see, but also for it to happen a lot quickly, because the climate crisis is not waiting for you.
Yeah, absolutely. There isn't much time. So, Nolita, I wondered if you wanted to weigh in at all on perhaps looking ahead to the next decade in terms of women's leadership and climate action. What do we need to be focusing on, and how do we make sure we get more of these leaders coming up and having a platform? Any advice to young people as well?
Thank you. Looking into the next decade, I think one thing that I find is often unspoken, but it's sort of there is a sense of awareness from most people that the status quo will not continue. And it cannot continue as things are going. And so no matter to Emma's point that the person with the most money often has the most to, is hurt the most, we also are learning over time is that the problem with that type of power is that they have the privilege to not have to learn about anything. They have the privilege to not have to learn about how to deal with crisis. They have the privilege to not have to learn about how to learn to be resilient, etc., which is also a fundamental knock to their kneecaps about how to deal with the next decade. Because if there was ever a place or a group of people who know how to thrive despite crisis, is African people, and also African women. So there's a big opportunity there for the narratives, the policy, and Pumla, to your point, the evidence to come from there. So for me, then a big thing becomes education and healthcare access, because for cisgender women, reproductive autonomy is a big thing, and it's something we don't talk about a lot, but it is an important thing, because then it opens up the space for, as I said, financial independence. And financial independence does then open up the space for you to be able to better participate in these types of spaces where you can learn more, you can engage in politics, you can engage in different spheres of society that you may have a more difficulty to if you did not have that type of autonomy. There's a big need for an increase in political leadership, a new type of political leadership, a political leadership that is ethical, a political leadership that is willing to embrace the humility of the fact that because you have power, it means that you have blind spots. There are things that you do not know. There are things you do not see, because you are then fundamentally removed from the material reality of most things, especially when you're in the African continent, because there is this big income divide. So just by being engaged in politics, you are then removed from the context. An anecdote about that is I was a training process engineer at Unilever for about a year. And one of the first things they said in training, because they make sure that you interact with every department, the lady from marketing, she said, "You are not the target market. Yes, you may use sunlight every day, but you are not the target market. Use the stats, use the information, the hard information to make your decisions. Because even if you grew up using the target, by the fact that you're employed here, you are no longer the target market. Be very aware of that. And that type of thing exists in most things, the creative industry, the industry that I'm in, etc. To have that humility to recognize that there are things you don't know, and hence there are conversations and people that you need to work with is important. And so then intergenerational collaboration, the last one, is going to be critical. I believe is going to be critical in the coming generation, because of the fact that we need to get past the adversarial relationships we have with older people. We need to get past many adversarial relationships we have with most things, the adversarial relationships we have with in colonial dynamics, in gender dynamics, etc., because we need to be able to harness the full innovation capacity of everyone that is here as humanity, so that we can thrive and have equity on a healthy planet. So then advice for younger people is three things that sorry, my answer's taking a while, but three things that I wish I had learned maybe 2 years ago, because I am a pandemic graduate, so new to the game, but to be aware of the sustainability industrial complex. And that speaks to the point I was making earlier, is that because you work in sustainability does not mean you know what it takes to be sustainable. And also, someone earlier had mentioned something about, or maybe I don't remember where I heard this, but something about actually, it was Dr. Wedi, that when you do something out of love, then you do not have, your product is better, but you also do not have to worry about all the other elements. One of those elements being your ambitions, the competition, etc. You have to make sure that that does not then become your priority. And then the last one is act now, apologize later. Which is a bit more controversial, but I wish I knew this earlier, because sometimes you wait for permission for people to allow you to do things. But as I said, because so many things are changing all at once, no one is actually sure what rules still matter. And because no one knows what rules still matter, you don't want to let someone else's risk-adverse nature stop you from doing something that you actually have a fundamental belief is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Nalita. Those are incredibly good points, great advice. And I'm sure that the thing about it being such a time of change, you know, it's so clear from everything that we're seeing, and that the status quo cannot continue, does mean that we have to think differently and maybe act more boldly. And the courage it's funny because you know, we're seeing so much courage from activists, but so little from corporate leaders, and that's really what we need to start to see. I think I will move to our final question, which is just around women in business leadership positions and those in the climate space. So how can they work effectively together? And I think this is really interesting for me because of what we were saying about the distance sometimes between what communities are living through and what the general public is receiving via communications and what people understand in the corporate sphere as to be the priority. Is there anyone who particularly would like to reach out to answer that? Or Kito, perhaps you have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'd love to give this question a stab. Having come into the climate space only in the recent years, so I'm not an expert, and so have very much been a curious student of the space and the activists that work within it. Particularly the women that champion and advocate in the space. The one common ground that I had seen in the climate space, very similar to other development issues that I've worked on across over the years, is still this idea that they are significant gatekeepers that are trying to keep them out. There are significant gatekeepers trying to keep them out of policy discussions, trying to keep them out of corporate discussions, trying to keep them out of the significant roles they could take up within their communities and spaces. And so as a woman who does enjoy the kind of privileges that I do just in my life and now through this business, I think one of the big mandates that I felt and trying to push for is this idea that we must we must give these women space, and we, as much as possible, need to get these women in the room. If you do have the privilege of being able to sit with the kind of partners and influencers and stakeholders who in any other circumstance would not listen, would not even have the opportunity to interact with some of these activists that work on the ground, I think it's key to put these women on in a very kind of colloquial, way, whether it is just very practically arranging meetings. If you know that you are the voice of credibility that would allow a business leader to be able to listen to someone from the community because you've brought them into your meeting, advocate for that. If you understand that you can arrange some kind of engagement or interaction with someone of influence that you know this activist, this champion is trying to reach. If you can be that bridge, do that. And from, at least again, with our company, it has been so much about trying to socialize the language, because again, to the point with Pumla and to what Nolito was saying, so much of this conversation, as we all know, has just been the difficulty of trying to deconstruct this language and actually realize we're saying the same thing. We're saying the same thing. And even if I'm just saying it in my own language, if I'm saying it in a way that you have not heard, with terms that you have not used, I might call it gender, you might call it water, you might call it sustainability. We are fundamentally talking about this at the heart of it, at the core of it, the same issues. And so for us, it's just trying to find that equalizer in language and having different partners understand that they are saying the same thing as you. It might come from, and you might hear it as anecdotal. It is more than anecdotal, to Pumla's point, and we don't need the altruistic, we don't need altruism. We need people to be practical, and you can take this from a scientific, standing, you can take this from an economic standing. It still stands, and what is being said is of value. And for us, this has been the big work in terms of trying to advocate and trying to champion and be allies to these young activists, is really trying to show if language is the big barrier as it stands right now, not having all experiences sit at the table equally. How do we break that down so that people can come in with their experiences in the ways that they want to express these experiences, and have people understand that we're not just talking from an anecdotal standpoint, right to Pumla's standpoint, that there's scientific basis around what is being said, that there's empirical basis around what is being said, and this is of value as we think to this new world. And these activists are able to offer a perspective and understanding and solutions to this new world, this post-30 world that you're trying to build. But it has to start with actually listening. Which I think is a key challenge that a lot of women face in whatever sphere you are, being heard without being seen as hysterical. So that is, I think, just on at least my journey with working with these young activists as a young woman, as a woman in the entrepreneurial space, just trying to create space, trying to put them on, and trying to socialize languages with others who have it, because we have that intersectionality. At least we sit with that intersectionality every day, trying to close the gap so that people can hear each other better.
Absolutely. The listening thing is so critical. Like, if we could just get leaders to listen, right, that would solve all our problems. And so beautifully and eloquently put. Thanks so much, Okido. So I guess are there any final comments from the panel? And then perhaps I'll just open it up to our attendees in case there's any questions. Emma.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I turned my camera off instead of mute. Isn't that joyful? I just had two thoughts as I was listening to all of that. And the first was a comment to what Tracy was talking about having these ESG teams in business. And I suppose in a way we have come quite far, because sort of 10 to 15 years ago, they wouldn't have had that. But the fact that it's still a team sitting within a business we've got a long way to go. These kind of values and purpose-driven need to come from the top, and they need to be in every part of the business, not just sitting in a team. And from really from a business point of view, is understanding that purpose-driven businesses are the future. Businesses are supported and grown by what their customers and consumers are wanting and needing, and they're looking for businesses that align with their values. And so really is understanding is that businesses need to start talking and acting in a way that resonates with sort of the people on the ground. They can't keep on just working in a way where they're ignoring what everyone else says. And it's not just about that from their consumers, but it's also about attracting and retaining the right talent. Because what we're finding is the people within our businesses, the ones that are the most creative, that are the ones that are the most driven, are also the ones that are the most aware of issues around them. And so that's something that sits quite close to me, is really understanding that from a business point of view. And then secondly, really is just going back to this talking again about who has the power or the biggest voice. Has always been those with the most money, but really also understanding that they are standing in the majority, they are the minority in terms of numbers. And we've got to start really understanding the power within the collective numbers, is that there's a lot of people, there's more people who are interested in what their future stands and wanting to understand what kind of place will be around for them when they're older, for their children. And so I think, all of us is understanding how we can get these people to understand their collective power that will eventually really be the one that has the biggest voice in the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. That's great points. And just to comment off what you were saying about the companies almost being like, it's weird when we see advertising and it kind of almost is devoid from the climate reality. It's starting to feel like when we saw ads with people without masks in the middle of the pandemic, it has this weird, like, the world's on fire, but we're still advertising flights to Greece, into the island that's on fire. Like, I don't know if you guys saw those adverts. It's just, it's ridiculous.
I think that soon we will look at these kind of adverts in the same way that we look at those old kind of Peter Stuyvesant commercials, when they'll have doctors all smoking and jumping, running around on yachts and running through the jungle. Soon we'll look at some of the stuff that's come out and go, oh my gosh, I actually can't believe that nonsense was happening, and we can only hope that that's where we're going. I do think as well, though, we need to, as a business and industry, start to look at the way these people are talking, these big businesses, and start to look at it in the same way that we do look at people who are promoting things like cigarettes or drinking and driving and all of these things that used to be socially acceptable, needs to be not socially acceptable anymore. And we need to start going, look, we don't want to be part of that. We don't think it's cool.
Completely agree. Pumla.
Yes, thank you. I think to Emma's final point, there is a organization called Fossil Free Ad Ban, and the entire mandate is trying to push against advertising from fossil fuel companies. I think you might be interested in checking that out. And I think I just wanted to say that with regards to the movement and us feeling sometimes as if we're not making changes or we're not seeing changes as quickly, that we should think and remember the feminist movement that started in the 60s. Well, of course, it probably started ever since women have ever been alive, but that is the date that Google will give you. And look at the incremental changes that they've been able to make over the last 50 years and the pushback that they've experienced. But the fact that even today they still remain and they're still holding strong, I think we can, because we're advocating for women, we can hold on to the fact that we are also doing something incrementally, but doing something one campaign at a time, one not taking a client that doesn't align with your values at a time, one giving advice to young women at a time, working with creators on the ground at a time. Like, there are incremental changes that we are making right now that we'll probably only see in the next 5 years, but we are doing this.
Yeah, those incremental changes all add up. And I was just thinking I would mention today on the call that, like, I personally went on a journey to look into how to invest in my retirement, in a way that isn't investing in fossil fuels, which is completely contradictory. And there's actually very few, I think there's possibly only one fund in South Africa that is 0% exposed to fossil fuels, called the BCI ESG Select Fund. So I would highly recommend anyone who has investments or is looking to save for their retirement to look at investing in that fund. That is the only local equity fund. And then I know that Tracy, I think it came up on my LinkedIn that you contributed to the Cambridge Sustainable Leadership course. Would you be able to quickly tell us about that? I think that's one of the great the things that leaders can look into as a resource potentially.
Yeah, so it's the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. They have a course on business and social justice, which is actually vanishingly rare to see those two things in the same sentence. So I would definitely recommend, that people look into that. I mean, it's obviously all of these things are, it's a combination of kind of, you don't want to be preaching to the converted, but then they've got to design these courses in a way that they appeal to people who need to be converted. So there's a tricky balance to be had there. And I found that quite tricky in my contribution, probably, you don't want to scare people away by being too activisty, how that goes. But yeah, it's an interesting course, definitely worth having a look at.
That's so interesting, that aspect of language, and especially as things become more and more urgent, so very interesting. Thanks, Tracy, for your thoughts on that. And are there any questions from our attendees? I don't know if we can, Emma, are you here, or Natalie, to help us gather any questions? If not, I'm just going to give a moment to the folks to post any questions.
Actually, one question that's come in. So how can audiences, and I think this is a good way to sort of wrap up the conversation around supporting work, rather comms, programs, campaigning, which is what most of our panelists are doing. So how can the audience support the work that you're doing or engage with your work and your efforts?
So from the Clean Creative side, obviously, we just encourage everyone who's a creative or working in the PR and advertising industry to take the Clean Creatives Pledge. It only takes a minute. It's at cleancreatives.org, and that means cutting ties with fossil fuels. Of course, there's this problem of greenwashing, and it brings increasing risks to agencies, and also slows down our transition to renewable energy. I'd love to send to Nalita next to have her suggestions.
Thank you. This was a thread that came up quite a few times, but also, Pumla, you said it explicitly, of that sometimes the challenge is that when women or young people or different types of communities are advocating for themselves, it's very much seen as anecdotal evidence. One thing that the program that I'm leading at the Club of Rome is looking at is to build the partnerships, especially between like different types of academic organizations and other research institutions, to bring forth this knowledge from different types of communities, and producing tangible knowledge that people can use to go then advocate for their work. But then there's an additional layer to that, is that obviously there's this big gap in like the communication of science and knowledge between, there's an article on Nature, and do people know what the article was trying to say, and then have, the narrative and the political push that then comes from that article. So that the invitation from me to this very early stage initiative is, if anyone is interested in seeing how to partner on something like that, it would be an important step forward to, one, support in building the evidence, but then using that evidence and communicating the policies or narratives that are necessary to support the type of work that's happening across the entire globe.
That sounds like another concrete step that we can get involved in. Are there any other thoughts from perhaps Pumla?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to bring up a question from a corner.
Great.
She said there's a huge digital divide in South Africa. How are we to be inclusive to communities with no access to the internet connection to the climate conversation? Sure, they are affected too, but don't have the platform to share their stories.
I think this is quite a good one for Pumla. Would you be able to take that? Pumla's frozen.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Sorry. So I think within campaigning, we went from sending emails to policymakers and those high ups in government, etc., to having to shift our mode of work to become more digital. And of course, we've left a huge part of the population behind because, I mean, in Africa, I think only 41 million people are actually on it, which also means we're using strategies from the West to try and gain audiences. So the best way we've been doing it currently is trying to find these grassroots organizations, partnering with them and using our platforms such as PowerShift or Don't Gas Africa campaign to bring more eyes onto the work that they do. So we're constantly looking for more communities to work with to try and elevate their voices. Of course, as I said earlier, in a way that they want to tell their stories and not in the way in which we want to tell their stories, so that we also afford people autonomy while we are telling their stories. So this isn't obviously an amazing feat, but it is what we can do with what we have right now. And I'm hopeful that as the digital spaces grow, we will continue to find more and more ways to include these communities and make sure that their voices are heard. But I will hand it over to Dr. Wedi, perhaps because she works on the ground with these communities, that she has a better strategy.
Thanks, Pumla. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I think PowerShift is a great example of an organization that has been able to, is really seriously thinking about this divide. What I would say on this point is essentially specifically for funders, for grantees, for investors. There's an entire ecosystem of partners who want to work. This issue is not going to be dealt with one organization, with one agency, etc. And so with understanding that there is an ecosystem with players that have been primed to deal with the issues that they feel like they're most equipped with, give them the funding to be able to do this work. And I say this, and when I say this, it's because I mean there are grassroots organizations that want to be on the ground but do not have investments, but they are most primed to be able to engage with the communities who otherwise not be able to engage with this on a digital platform. And there are those who are working on a digital platform, and this is where their bag lies, and who are probably not the best to be the ones in the community doing that kind of I call it guerrilla tactics work, as we think about it from a communications perspective. And so if we can prime this if we can think about this as an ecosystem and think about it as, who is best placed to kind of do this work so that we are able to close this gap, to reach those who otherwise will not be able to engage with this work from a digital perspective, understanding that we are in an African context, but also looking beyond just the problem and understanding that there are solutions everywhere. There are guys on the ground everywhere who are doing, not even who want to do this work, but who are doing this work currently, but are stuck on the issues of just not having the resources to do it. I think there's a clear gap there, and in this way we can actually prime the ecosystem so that we can reach more people. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm very passionate about that one. So yeah.
That was really beautifully answered, and completely agree that it's like the ecosystem that has to change. I just thought I'd quickly add that Emma had to drop off, but we're so grateful for her insights during this call. And yeah, in terms of that ecosystem, like I think whether, with Clean Creatives, it really does try to push the whole system through into a different direction. And we're trying to sort of speak up for what kind of incentives could we put towards the corporate sector to work with agencies that don't hold fossil fuel clients, for example. Can there be a kind of BEE score for the climate? And what other mechanisms can we put in place that encourages more collaborative and consultative approaches to communities that are affected? I think if there's no further questions, we'll probably have to close out here. Are there any final thoughts from the panel, or I think we've all exhausted all our options, and But it was really wonderful to hear from you all. And let me quickly hand it back to Natalie. Oh, there's a final thought from Pumla?
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to say though that despite the fact that we constantly want to be on digital platforms and we want the work to be seen digitally, it does not mean that the work is not happening on the ground, because ultimately what is important is what we are seeing on the ground and the changes that we are seeing on the ground. And these are the changes that will determine the future that we see.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, just as you were speaking, I remembered that I met someone personally from Senegal who was an affected community, thanks to Don't Gas Africa and the efforts of your team, who told me about BP and their gas rig off the coast there and how it's affecting fishing communities. And that made its way into our F-list report, which was hugely publicized. And it was really because, you facilitated those connections from community through to the mainstream press and going from periphery into mainstream and trying to push the center, in the direction. That's kind of like what I get really excited about. So thanks again to everyone. Natalie, if you'll just close us off for the day.
Amazing. Such a vibrant, wonderful discussion. I've taken away so much. And I think that we need to have more of these conversations where we can, sort of cross-pollinate knowledge sharing and all of that. But on behalf of She Changes Climate, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, our panelists, to the Clean Creative South Africa team, and to everyone who's joined us online. This recording will be available on YouTube, on the She Changes Climate YouTube afterwards. And yeah, much gratitude. I will also just share a link to our newsletter. So we send a newsletter at the end of every month, just with highlights of the work that we're doing, the campaign that we're running, and also a link to our social media pages for those who would like to engage with us there. So I think we can end there right on time. Thank you, Stephen. Amazing, amazing moderation. And I wish you all a great day ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.